Speaking of Christ, Paul says in Colossians chapter 1 verse 15 that, quote, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation." This verse is often cited by groups who deny the deity of Christ to assert that Jesus is a created being. Why does Paul refer to Jesus in this way? Did Paul believe that Jesus was a created being? In order to answer these questions, let's consider a few other passages of Scripture. We'll begin with Genesis chapter 41. Verses 50 to 52 describe the birth of two of Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. This passage states that Manasseh was born first of the two boys. Thus we see that the term firstborn is used with regard to its plain meaning. With that on the table, let's now turn to Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 9. In contrast to Genesis chapter 41, Yahweh states here that, quote, "Ephraim is my firstborn." The Hebrew word in both of these passages is the same, bakor. With this being the case, how do we reconcile these two passages? The answer is that firstborn, in addition to its plain meaning, is also a term used to describe preeminence. In other words, authority, power, favor, or rulership. In Jeremiah chapter 31, Yahweh is foretelling of how he will reconstitute Israel. Though it will appear to the other nations that Israel has been abandoned by God, this prophecy tells us the opposite. Israel, or Ephraim, is the firstborn among the nations to Yahweh. He is not saying that Israel is the oldest nation. He is saying that it is the preeminent nation, because it is the one he has covenanted with. A similar use is found in Psalm 89 verse 27, wherein Yahweh speaks of appointing David as his firstborn, quote, "the highest of the kings of the earth." Many kings came and went on earth before David was ever born. Thus, David is not the firstborn king in a chronological sense. What God is saying is that David is the preeminent king of his time, the one to whom God has granted his blessing and favor. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the translators used the word prototokos to render bakor. This is the word that Paul uses in Colossians chapter 1 to describe Jesus as the quote-unquote firstborn. By using this word, there are two possible things that Paul is attempting to say. One, Jesus was literally the firstborn or first created being. Or two, Jesus is the preeminent being over all creation. How do we know which use Paul is appealing to? The answer is context. We must consider the rest of Paul's statement in Colossians to properly interpret him. He speaks of Jesus as the creator of all things. He also describes Jesus as, quote, "before all things." In other words, Jesus is eternal. For Paul to describe Christ as the eternal creator of all things rules out the possibility that he believed Christ was a created being of some kind. Thus, Paul's use of prototokos, or firstborn, is with respect to the preeminent authority of Christ over all things as God incarnate.